chapter 5. After this, we're going to get into individual organ systems. So this really finishes our baseline of what we're going to be doing to get ready for learning about each individual system. So cells that we talked about last week are organized into tissues. Tissues are groups of cells that are doing a single or similar function for the cell. And when we study those, but particularly with a microscope, that science is called histology. And what you did in the lab last week was really histology. We were doing a chapter on cells, but you were looking at tissues. Hopefully you could identify individual cells within those tissues. There are 4 major types of tissues in the body: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Obviously there are lots of different cells, but they make up these tissues, and each of these tissues is going to have some separate categories of that tissue within them. So epithelial tissues in general protect, secrete, absorb, or excrete something for the body. They are going to be found on the body surface, covering and lining internal organs. And what you might not think of as epithelial tissue is actually glandular tissue, which is during development derived from epithelial tissues. We'll talk about the distinguishing characteristics of each tissue as we come to it. Connective tissues are tissues that bind, support, protect, fill up space, store fat, produce blood cells. Connective tissue is a pretty broad category. There are lots of ways that things connect one another. Blood you might not think about as being a connective tissue, but it is. Muscles are involved in movement. There are 3 types of muscles, but they're all involved in movement. For skeletal muscle, they're attached to a bone. For smooth muscle, they're in the walls of hollow organs, and cardiac muscle is found in the heart. Muscles have the ability to forcibly shorten. Keep that in mind. That's all they can do is contract. So all the movements we have to talk about have to be explained by contraction, not by pushing. Pulling, not pushing. And nervous tissue is that tissue that propagates electrical signals throughout the body. It's part of our control systems that we've talked about before. Communication system. In order for these cells to work together, they are joined by different structures, cell connections that we touched on last week in the in-person lecture, but this book moves it to the tissues, and that's probably a better place for it. They help organize tissues more than they do individual cells, I think, in one sense. So tight junctions are membranes of adjacent cells that merge and fuse. They're located among cells that are going to form linings. They're going to be create sheet-like layers of tissue. We'll have these in the blood-brain barrier, and when we talk about the central nervous system, we'll talk more about that blood-brain barrier. There are also structures called desmosomes, which are kind of spot welds, little places where they are connected tightly. They give you a lot of structural reinforcement, but still allow for some movement. The outer layers of the skin will have these desmosomes. And then there are gap junctions, and gap junctions are really tubes, windows, doors, directly between cells, so the cytoplasm is almost shared at those locations. And they are found in cardiac muscle cells. We'll see them there. We'll call them the structure that you looked at in the lab on Thursday last week, the intercalated disc. So tight junctions are close spaces between cells, and they form membranes, and we'll talk a little bit about membranes in a couple of sections. Desmosomes bind cells together, helping to hold them together, but not as tightly and not as much of a barrier as the tight junctions. And then gap junctions are tubes, entryways connecting the cytoplasm. So in fact, when we talk about the heart, we will say that it behaves as a syncytium, a one large cell more than a group of individual cells. So from science to technology, nanotechnology is working to get across the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier has been a It is a good thing to have, but it is difficult for us to get medications into the central nervous system in many cases because of this blood-brain barrier. So if we could find a way to get things across that we wanted to get across, it would be very helpful. Chemicals that are allowed to cross would be lipid-soluble molecules, small molecules. But nerve cells, when we get to it, really can't tolerate much of a change in their surrounding conditions. Their range of tolerance is much less than most cells. So the blood-brain barrier helps to keep them within their range of tolerance. We can use nanotechnology if we can get things smaller than 100 nanometers, and they can go in one direction to help medications cross. Anesthetics. All anesthetics will cross the blood-brain barrier. Chemotherapeutics that are combined with liposomes, making them more lipid-soluble, can get across. Insulin can be inhaled in nanoparticles instead of being injected. I won't tell you I'm a big expert on nanotechnology. I haven't looked at it very much, but you'll read about it, and it's important for drug delivery, perhaps, in the future. Okay, we'll end it there.